Welcome to the MacArthur Memorial podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore the life and legacy of General of the Army Douglas MacArthur and discuss a wide range of military history topics from the American Civil War to the Korean War. On October 26, 2024, the MacArthur Memorial and the Hampton Roads Naval Museum commemorated the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Leyte Gulf with a series of presentations. Thomas Cutler, a retired U.S. Navy officer and a preeminent naval historian, presented a lecture entitled The Naval Battle of Leyte Gulf. The following is the podcast version of his talk. If you would like to see the pictures and other slides he used, you can also find the presentation on the MacArthur Memorial's YouTube channel. There is a link to that version of the presentation in this episode description.
Well, after that introduction and the opening remarks, I'm not sure there's much left to say. That was a very good summary of the coming battle, but hopefully I can shed a little bit more light. I was within several days of going to my in-country tour in Vietnam, and for some reason I'd gone to some kind of a formal event and wore my dress whites. And in the Navy, the dress whites include a ceremonial sword. And after the event, we went back to the house and had some friends over, and people were interested in that sword. You know, swords are kind of unique, and they wanted to see this thing or whatever. So that evening, I was putting my 4-year-old son to bed, and I could tell something was bothering him. And I said, "What's going on, Chris?" And he said, "I'm depressed." 4-year-old son. And I said, "Well, what are you depressed about?" And he said, "Well, you're going off to Vietnam to fight the bad guys, and you're awful slow taking that sword out." True story. Well, we're not here to talk about Vietnam, certainly not here to talk about me, but we are here to talk about sailors going to war. And this was, as has already been mentioned several times, the largest naval battle in history. You can see from the slide up here why I say that. Spanning, already pointed out, more than 100,000 square miles. Lots of people died on both sides in this battle. One of the interesting parts of it is that it covered every facet of naval warfare that existed at the time, and that's one of the things that makes it interesting. Keep in mind, we called it a battle. It's really a series of battles that all take place within a couple of days. But it is, in fact, a huge endeavor. As already mentioned, it's the last clash of battleships. It's the only time a U.S. aircraft carrier was sunk by gunfire. And as you see by the alternating blues and reds in that thing below, there's a lot about the battle, both good and bad, that we can learn from and be inspired by. The origins of that, as we stand here in this hallowed hall, begin with General Douglas MacArthur's having to leave the Philippines early in the war and being forced to leave by FDR. As you can imagine, there was a certain reluctance to carry out that order. But when he arrived in Australia, he promised the Filipino people and the world that he would return. And of course, that's why we're here to talk about that return today. The reason that, a little background we should know, is that Nimitz and MacArthur both commanded separate theaters during World War II. Nimitz handling the Central Pacific with the famous places at Tarawa and Midway and various other battles that I'm sure you're all familiar with. And then MacArthur, in the meantime, was running the Southwest Pacific Command. And they operated virtually independently throughout most of the war. However, at one point, these two advancing prongs came together, and it was a question of where to go next. They had conquered the things that they were required to, and now there was a question of where to go. Well, the Navy, and Nimitz in particular, wanted to go to Formosa, today's Taiwan. They felt that was the best strategic move at this point in the war. But the Army under MacArthur, as you can imagine, wanted to go to the Philippines for a number of reasons. And it actually came down to the commander-in-chief mediating between these two. FDR actually boarded a cruiser, the cruiser Baltimore, and traveled out to Pearl Harbor. And he met there with MacArthur and Nimitz, and they, in turn, were given the opportunity to express their views of where we should go next. FDR made the ultimate decision based on MacArthur's persuasiveness to go back to the Philippines. One of the arguments that he made, one of the most valid arguments, was that he said that the Filipino people understand why we were driven out by Japan early in the war. They understand that it takes time to come back, but they will never understand if we bypass them at this point in the war. And I think that was a very telling argument among many others. As a result, MacArthur won and was able to conduct Operation King II, which was the return to the Philippines, the amphibious landing on Leyte Island. To do this, as I mentioned, MacArthur had Navy forces under him, under Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid with the 7th Fleet, and Nimitz had the 3rd Fleet, sometimes called the 5th Fleet, but that's another story, but the 3rd Fleet under Admiral Halsey. So they were coming together to conduct a joint operation for the first time in the Philippines. So you have these two important fleets coming together. The missions, as you can see, the 7th Fleet took on the mission of the actual amphibious assault and the support forces to do that. The 3rd Fleet was there to, quote, support and defend. Not in a whole lot of detail there, but that was what it was there for, tasked with. As you can imagine, or you should be aware that the 3rd Fleet was a ginormous fleet, probably the largest fleet in history, with tremendous capability, and Halsey and this 3rd Fleet are lurking around the Philippines in case the Japanese show up. So here you have the General Douglas MacArthur in charge of one side of the operation and Nimitz on the other. What's interesting about this is that if you want an overall commander between these two gentlemen, you have to go all the way to Washington, D.C. There is no on-scene commander in charge of the whole operation. And they're operating, even though they're in the same vicinity, they're operating largely independently, not even talking to each other in many cases. The Japanese come up with a response that they call Operation Show 1, Victory 1 was the translation. They had 4 converging forces coming to, for virtually a last stand attempt to try to stop this. Here you see the Philippines, and you have Admiral Kurita coming up from down south where the oil was, bringing a rather large force of battleships and cruisers, and coming up, and he's going to cross the Sibuyan Sea and come out through San Bernardino Strait, and will ultimately attack the forces at Leyte from the north. Admiral Nishimura, also coming up from the south, has a group that is going to go across the Sulu Sea and come up through Surigao Strait and attack from the south. There's also another force under Admiral Shima coming down from the north who has the same mission as Nishimura, but the two are not coming together. They actually are supposed to arrive at the same time. And last but not least is Admiral Ozawa, and he has a rather interesting role in all of this. He has what's left of the Japanese carrier forces, and those forces at this point in the war are decimated. The ships are there, but the aircraft and pilots are not. There are about 100 aircraft that's left for these aircraft carriers. We, the United States, do not know that. We know they've been hurt, but we don't know to what degree. So because of that, at this point in the war, the carriers have played the major force in the war. And so the idea for Ozawa is to come down from the north and hopefully lure the Americans under Admiral Halsey to go after them. So what you have here is 2 vital elements, a pincher movement coming down from the north and from the south, and you also have a decoy hoping to lure off major parts of the American fleet there. The problem with this, of course, is that a pincher needs perfect timing. It's kind of like having a pair of pliers with only one side. It doesn't do much good. And the other one is a decoy, of course, needs a lot of luck. You have to depend, you're scripting the enemy to do what you're bidding. You're hoping that the enemy will take the bait as it was. So a quick overview of the battle. The way it takes place is the American forces land at Leyte, and the amphibious landing goes pretty much as planned, no major problems there. You've got the American 3rd Fleet lurking out there, as I said, standing by. The first thing that comes up is the force under Admiral Kurita is coming along the Palawan Passage. And en route there, he encounters 2 American submarines. And that is the first engagement of the forces during this battle. The next part takes place in the Sibuyan Sea, has already mentioned, there are air attacks there. The Halsey's forces are dropping many bombs on these forces and causing a great deal of damage and slowing Kurita's progress down. Down here you have the Battle of Surigao Strait. We'll talk about that when these forces come up from the south. And then up to the way to the north is the Battle of Cape Engano, where Halsey does engage Ozawa's forces up there. And of course, then we also have, the Battle off Samar, which is probably the most famous part of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. As I mentioned, the first blood occurs when Kurita is coming up from the south, going along Palawan Passage there, and these two American submarines, the Darter and the Dace, are there waiting, and they see, this is an actual photograph taken from one of the submarines, that's Kurita's force coming north, rather formidable even at that distance. But the submarines are positioned such that they sink two of the cruisers in this force, the Maya and the Otago. They also damage another one, but one of the ships, the Otago, turns out to be Kurita's flagship. So the admiral who is in charge of this fleet is going for a midnight swim as a result. And this is pretty significant. He doesn't die here, he's rescued, but his staff is now picked up by different ships after the catastrophe. His charts and plans and things like that are lost. So now he's continuing the battle with a lesser staff and not the equipment he came with. He moves over to the super battleship Yamato. Why he wasn't on there in the first place, I'm not entirely sure, but that's one I would have picked. But at any rate, he's now on the Yamato, but he's somewhat hampered in his original initiative. They also managed to damage another cruiser, and two destroyers go escorting them off. So his force has been somewhat diminished, but it still consists of these two super battleships, Yamato and Musashi, and many other cruisers and battleships. So during the daylight, Admiral Kurita is now trying to cross the Sibuyan Sea, and at the same time, the other admirals that are coming up from the south are crossing the Sulu Sea. And Admiral Halsey's reconnaissance aircraft detect them and start bombing them all day. They continuous attacks going on relentlessly all day. Huge number of aircraft attacking these forces. These guys do not have time to eat a meal or do anything. They're just constantly under attack. The Japanese do try one thing with the Musashi and the Yamato. They load in these shells that are full of shrapnel, and the idea, because they don't have any air cover, they're going to fire a barrage of these super 18.1-inch shells to put up a barrage of shrapnel that would hopefully bring down American aircraft. Wasn't very successful, but at least it was an effort on their part. Musashi ultimately succumbs. Many of the pilots concentrate on this huge target being the obvious one, and after many hits and so forth, she finally sinks. This was a ship that was at one time considered unsinkable, but we've heard that term too many times in history. Kurita at this point is, what's the point? He's getting nowhere, he's getting decimated, so he turns around and starts heading back to the west. So that's where we stand at this point. But then we reach the night of 24-25 October. And here, with Kurita, when darkness comes in, he's no longer under attack. He now decides to continue his mission, and he goes back east again towards San Bernardino Strait. Nishimura and Shima are coming up, heading for Surigao Strait. Admiral Kincaid, who's in charge of the forces there of the 7th Fleet at Leyte, makes preparations. Halsey, we'll talk about a little bit later. Kincaid tasks his Admiral Jesse Ohlendorf to prepare a welcome to the oncoming Japanese forces. For that, he has PT boats that he stations down at the southern end of Surigao Strait. And they have two tasks. One is to provide early warning to let them know when the Japanese are in fact coming, and the other one is to attack them with torpedo boats. The battleships, he puts it a line way up north, steaming back and forth across Surigao Strait. What's interesting about these battleships is that several of them have been raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor. After the attack at Pearl Harbor, we actually brought a number of these ships back to life. One of the most interesting operations ever is that one of them had turned turtle and was completely upside down, and they put winches on there and over months slowly winched this ship back upright and then brought it back into service. So you have these battleships up there getting a chance at some revenge for Pearl Harbor. Then the cruisers are a little further south with their shorter range weapons, and they too are steaming back and forth across the strait. And then the destroyers are positioned on both flanks, and their task is to come down along the flanks and to use torpedoes primarily to attack the oncoming Japanese forces. Torpedoes are a very effective weapon against ships for obvious reasons. They hit below the waterline. And the other thing that they're good for is that they do not, guns put off flashes at night. And if you're fighting at night, you don't necessarily want to reveal your position. So torpedoes are a better choice of weapon for that reason. Well, the whole thing plays out as planned. As Nishimura is coming up, Kurita's behind him, by the way, but Nishimura is heading up. And the PT boats, in fact, attack and have very little effect, but they do, in fact, provide the early warning that was needed. And then the battleships and the cruisers open fire, and there's a tremendous barrage of gunfire coming down the Gulf, hitting these ships as they're down the strait as they're coming north. And then the destroyers, in fact, do their attack. The end result is that the Japanese are really hurt. Several things happen. One of the reasons for this is that it was already mentioned, the crossing the T. This is a tactic that's well known in naval circles. Because ships are long and narrow, it's obvious that they have more guns along their sides than they do on the bow or the stern. So if you can get your ship broadside to another ship, you obviously have got a lot more firepower to bring to bear. And what's also important here is that the same thing applies to formations as well as to individual ships. So in fact, the Japanese their T is crossed, suffered great damage as a result. And then the Japanese compounded by their two serious mistakes. The first one is that there's no coordination between Nishimura and Shima. Shima's following up. Nishimura is taking a hellacious pounding up there. He doesn't even bother to tell Shima what's going on. These two gentlemen did not like each other. They couldn't even decide which one outranked the other. They were always fighting about who was senior. So they didn't communicate as a result of this, even in the middle of this terrific battle. So Nishimura doesn't do Shima any favors there. And then also there's a thing called the turn versus the corpin. And if you're not familiar with naval tactics, a turn is when all the ships if you have ships in a line and they all turn at the same time, you wind up reversing the column, if you will, in place so that the lead ship now becomes the last ship. The corpin is where the ships follow one another. It's kind of like a choo-choo train. If you start turning, when the first ship turns, the second ship follows, and they all go around that way. Well, as it is, Kurita orders what should have ordered a turn to get out from under that fire, but instead ordered a corpin, which meant that each of his ships took a turn going up under all that hellacious fire. Keep in mind, by the way, that Kurita has gone through a midnight swim. He's been attacked all day the day before. This guy is probably a bit fatigued, if nothing else. So now we talk about Halsey. Halsey's interesting because he was the class in 1904. He earned his wings 30 years later. That's not the way we do it these days. He actually became a pilot that late. Very colorful character. The press loved him. He was very flamboyant, gave a lot of colorful lines to be quoted and so forth. He also was, I say, itching for a fight. And that's kind of a pun in a way because, well, first of all, he wanted to fight desperately. He was a very pugnacious admiral. But as things played out, he missed the Battle of Midway because he had a skin disease that caused tremendous discomfort. He had to be admitted in the hospital. And Spruance wound up taking command of the fleet and became the famous victor at Midway. So Halsey missed that. He was then sent to the South Pacific on Nimitz's orders and did a great job down there, but he was not commanding a fleet per se in those waters. And then as the war progressed, he just always missed the big fights. And when the Battle of the Philippine Sea comes along later, Spruance is in command at that time, and Halsey in fact, misses that as well. So he really is desperate to get into a fleet battle. These are Nimitz's instructions to Halsey, telling him to cover and support the forces there in the Southwest Pacific, destroy enemy naval and air forces threatening the Philippine area. I mentioned the Spruance factor in that last slide, and I want to explain that very quickly. At the Battle of Philippine Sea, Spruance was criticized after the battle because even though it was a tremendous American victory, he allowed the Japanese fleet to turn away and to escape, as some people put it. Spruance's explanation, and I agree with him, was that his job was to guard that landing at all costs, not knowing whether other Japanese forces might come from a different direction and so forth. So I think, but he was criticized, should have gone after it, could have ended the Japanese fleet there and then and so forth. So this is also in the back of Halsey's mind. So Halsey saw Kurita turn west in the Sibuyan Sea the day before. His reconnaissance now picks up Ozawa coming down from the north. Ozawa's doing everything he can to be discovered. He's flying what few planes he has down and hoping that Halsey's forces will see him. He even has some of his aircraft lower their tail hooks to make it clear that these are naval aircraft as opposed to land-based. So it's a more tempting target for the Americans. But they do pick up them, and then Halsey decides to go after Ozawa. Absolutely nothing wrong with this decision. I think anybody would say, of course, he would go after enemy forces, carrier forces to the north. Again, keep in mind, he does not know how impotent these carriers are at this point. So he sees them as a genuine threat. The problem with this is that he takes the entire Third Fleet with him when he goes. This is the largest fleet in history, has 4 gigantic task forces, each one with multiple aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers. It's an overwhelming force. Halsey could very well have divided his force, left some behind, and then taken plenty up there to take care of Ozawa. But instead, he took the whole fleet. He does go up to Cape Engano, does attack up there, has a successful campaign against these ships. As I said, they don't have much to fight with. 108 planes against this entire fleet. And conducts airstrikes all day and does a successful operation there. But there's a serious problem going on at this point. And that is because Halsey has taken the force northward, the entire force. And unfortunately, there's been some misunderstandings. Before he left, he had actually proposed, but did not execute, the breaking off of a surface combatant task force to stay behind and guard the landing force. The problem is that Kincaid, remember, these people they're not technically working together, they're not communicating, but Kincaid's been reading Halsey's mail, if you will. He's been hearing these messages, and he makes the assumption that this task force was in fact formed and left behind. Nimitz back in Pearl Harbor also makes the same assumption. As a result, Nimitz gets concerned. There's something going on. He's starting to get some desperate messages, and we'll talk about why in just a minute. But things are not going well off Samar, and he becomes concerned, and he sends a message to Halsey, and he says, "Where is Task Force 34?" And what compounds this thing is the fact that back at this time, to help confuse code breakers and so forth, it was common practice to put padding on each end of a message. Nonsense type messages that didn't mean anything, but they would make the message harder to break for the enemy. This one had at the beginning of it, "Turkey trots to water," whatever that means. And unfortunately, the one at the end was picked by somebody picked these out, and I suspect that he was aware of the fact that this was also the anniversary of the Battle of Balaclava during the Crimean War. And at that time, Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote his famous poem, "The Charge of the Light Brigade." And in that poem, the phrase, "the world wonders," appears in that poem. So one can only speculate, but for whatever reason, this phrase is appended there. Means nothing, but Halsey, for some reason, doesn't realize it's padding, and he thinks that Nimitz is prodding him. Nimitz is criticizing him. The world's wondering, where are you? Where the hell is this? That type thing. So Halsey is humiliated and angry, literally throws his cap across the bridge, turns around and heads south to try to get into the battle that's now forming to the south. Unfortunately, it's too late, and the entire Third Fleet now spends the rest of this battle in limbo. Wonderful passage in Herman Wouk's novel, The War and Remembrance. He describes Pug Henry, the major battleship commander there, describing what it was like to be there at this time, and so in this moment in history, and being unable to do anything, to be in this state of limbo. At any rate, so what you've got here is you've got the landing forces landed, the Seventh Fleet battleships and so forth are there. Halsey's up to the north. Nishimura and Shima have gotten the attention of the Seventh Fleet. They're now at Surigao Strait, and Halsey is now lured away by Ozawa, and now you have this landing force with no protection or very little protection. What is left, and of course Kurita has continued through, and he comes through San Bernardino Strait that morning, starts heading south, and he's now going to become a major threat to the landing force there. The only thing left for this landing force to protect it are three task groups with code names Taffy. That doesn't mean anything other than just a code name, but Taffy 1, 2, and 3. These are made up of escort carriers, CVEs. These are very small aircraft carriers, much smaller than the fleet types that are out there launching the major airstrikes and that sort of thing. They primarily provide support, landing support to the troops ashore, and also engage submarines if they happen to show up. They're not equipped for a major fleet battle. In fact, the aircraft there have anti-personnel bombs on them, not anti-ship. And these three Taffy groups made up of these aircraft carriers and their escorts, which are destroyers and escorts, are now very vulnerable to this gigantic fleet. So Kurita's coming down from the north. With these 1, 2, and 3 left, the CVEs start, as you can well imagine, heading south very quickly. Their maximum speed, unfortunately, is 18 knots with a good tailwind. Kurita's force is good up to 20, 25, 30 knots. So it's going to be a losing race at this point. So Kurita is bearing down on particularly on Taffy 3, the one furthest to the north. Now, this is one of the great moments in naval history that I think we need to pause and think about. These aviators on these carriers do not have proper weapons to fight. They are grossly outnumbered by the number of guns and that sort of thing, and yet they attack. They attack with everything they've got. Some of them are dropping depth charges because that's all they had. They're dropping, many of them are strafing Kurita's force, which actually has, I think, a significant effect because while he's trying to do his thing, he's constantly having to duck while these aircraft are strafing the bridges and so forth. But they do this at great risk and loss to themselves. And then there's also the destroyers and the destroyer escorts. Now, you can look in American naval history and find other feats that will equal this in terms of courage, but you'll never find anything more courageous, I think, than this. These are tiny ships by comparison to Kurita's force. We're talking battleships and cruisers, and we have destroyers and destroyer escorts. Incredibly outgunned and everything. And yet they charge. And the one that leads the way is the destroyer USS Johnston. And she's kind of interesting because she's commanded by Commander Ernest E. Evans. He is a Native American graduate of the Naval Academy, class of 1931. At the commissioning of his ship back in Seattle, Washington, he tells the crew that, well, quickly you should know that he was, in the beginning of the war, he was actually at the Battle of Java Sea and wound up, the Americans had to flee that area because there was no way they could stand up to the Japanese. And as he told his crew, I once ran from the Japanese Navy. I promise you I will never do that again. And he also told them, if any of you do not want to go with me, I intend to go in harm's way, quoting John Paul Jones. And if any of you do not want to go with me, there's the gangway. You can leave now. None of the crew left. As a result of his actions, by the way, he was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. So what we have here, I mentioned the charge of the Light Brigade. There's some comparison here, I think. You have this Kurita's battleship and cruiser force bearing down. As they come down, he begins to sink these American ships. You got to understand, these ships are charging at these much more powerful ships, some of them getting in so close that the battleships and cruisers the Japanese cannot depress their guns low enough to shoot at them. They're in that close firing, but they're also eventually grossly outgunned, and they begin to pay the price. The Hoel and we have several ships that are sunk. They eventually even get one of the aircraft carriers, the Gambier Bay, is sunk by gunfire. Then at the critical moment, when all appears to be about as bad as it can be, for some reason, Kurita inexplicably breaks off and heads north. You got to love the American sailor. But it is true that, in fact, Kurita did turn away. There's a great deal of speculation about why he did that. If we had time, we could go into a lot of that. But I do think it has a lot to do with several things. One is Kurita, of course, as I mentioned, was probably exhausted by this point, maybe not making the best decisions. But also, Kurita was not exactly sure what he was encountering. He did not know for sure that there was more out there than just these three small task groups. And particularly the fact, and I think because the Americans attacked so aggressively, despite the odds, I think he probably had a feeling in the back of his mind like, what do they know that I don't? And I think that had a lot to do with his decision. At any rate, it works out. We have these four major engagements. This is actually the end of the Japanese fleet, per se. The Yamato, by the way, does survive, but goes back to Japan. But she gets underway for a suicide mission where she's going down to Okinawa later to actually beach herself and use her big guns to try to help the forces ashore there. And she is also sunk before she gets there. So this is really the end of the Japanese fleet as we know it. However, it's at this same battle that we have the Japanese turning to the divine wind, the kamikaze. And this, of course, becomes the equivalent of what we would call a human-guided missile today. These are literally guided missiles. They're guided by humans instead of electronics that we would do today, but they have the same kind of effect. Very difficult to defend against, and we suffered tremendous casualties at Okinawa and as a result of that. Finally, and by the way, a good friend of mine told me anytime you're giving a talk, include that word. It gives the audience hope. Finally, I want to just, if you'll bear with me, I want to share something with you. This is the last words of my book on Battle of Leyte Gulf, and I think they say a lot about what we're discussing here. War is probably mankind's greatest folly. It is wasteful, tragic, and frequently unnecessary. But when it does occur, in an ironic twist, it brings out what is in some ways best about mankind. Many brave men, American and Japanese, fought at Leyte Gulf. Too many died there, while others live even today as flesh and blood monuments to those virtues that shine forth from the wreckage and tragedy of war. The causes for which these men fought and sacrificed have faded with time. The machines they used to carry out their deadly business are now rusted relics of another era. The sands have swallowed their footprints, and the waters show no trace of their wakes. But the glory of their deeds will never be tarnished by time.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions, the MacArthur Memorial team wants to hear from you. You can reach us at macarthurmemorial@norfolk.gov or find us on X at MacArthur1880 or on Facebook and Instagram as MacArthur Memorial.